So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the sixth and final workshop in a series hosted by the West Valley Action Network called the Climate Cleanup and Accountability at West Valley Nuclear Waste Site in 2021. Miałe Skano, I'm Kriki Kazak, I'm Seneca Hawk Clan in Polish, and I work on Buffalo Commons, which is a joint collaboration between Partnership for the Public Good, PPG, a community-based think tank in Buffalo, New York, and Cornell ILR Buffalo CoLab. PPG has partnered with the West Valley Action Network and Western New York Environmental Alliance to host these workshops. West Valley Action Network is a group of individuals and organizations in the US and Canada that came together in 2009 to work for the full cleanup of the West Valley nuclear site in West Valley, New York, Cattaraugus County, draining into Erie County and the Great Lakes. To learn more about the current concerns of this network, you can visit the website, which I'll place in the chat in just a bit. Other workshops from this series can be viewed on the Western New York Environmental Alliance website, which will also be placed in the chat. They include the history of the West Valley Nuclear Waste Site and Action Needed, parts 1 and 2, and Indigenous People for a Nuclear-Free Future, and more. Before we get started, it would be great if everyone could introduce themselves in the chat. We want to make sure it's working. You could say your name, where you're joining us from, and anything you're wondering about today's session. You could also put if you've joined us for any of the previous sessions. If you need closed captioning, there's a button at the bottom labeled CC that should be able to accommodate that. Today, we are joined by Barbara Warren. Barbara is a registered nurse with a master's in science. Executive Director of Citizens Environmental Coalition, and today she will review findings of reports that have been written on West Valley site, and she will detail plans for North and South Plateaus, waste tanks, and disposal areas. Diane DeRigo, the Radioactive Waste Project Director for Nuclear Information and Resource Services, will also be available at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have questions throughout the conversation today, feel encouraged to type them in the chat, and I will lift them up to our presenters during the Q&A portion at the end of our time. So without further ado, I'll pass it to Barbara.
Good evening, everyone. Pleasure to have you here. Where I live, which is in Orange County, New York, it's been raining very hard all day, and I thought we were going to have flooding, but not so. We're doing okay. So I hope everyone is fine. I hope they've had better weather than I've had today. And I'm going to proceed to talk to you about West Valley. At least I think I am. And it appears to not be working.
You can also try to use your mouse to click on the slides.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay, I wanted to start with some good news because the rest of the presentation is really not good news, but we have some good news. West Valley was built to engage in nuclear waste reprocessing. Nuclear Fuel Services, which was the company, operated for just 6 years, 1962 to 72, and it required upgrades to continue operating, which were costly. So NFS, Nuclear Fuel Services, eventually abandoned the project, but they had only been operating for 6 years. President Carter halted reprocessing efforts in the US in April of 1977, determining that the risks of nuclear weapons proliferation were too great a risk for the nation. This is a risk for reprocessing, that people will have easier access to weapons material to develop weapons themselves. So recently, after promoting reprocessing for years, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or NRC, decided in spring of this year to abandon consideration of reprocessing for the future. So to me, that was great news. I was very happy to hear that. So let's go on. West Valley site was chosen in the 1960s before any of our major environmental laws in the 70s were passed. The site was particularly unsuitable, but basically what they were looking for was just any empty site that nobody wanted or felt it was very valuable. And so they chose this site, but it was incredibly unsuitable. There were high plateaus with loose soils and steep grades. There were many wetlands on the property and streams that crossed the property. One of the first sole source aquifers identified by EPA lies below the site. No laws and criteria for siting a very hazardous facility and its operation existed at the time. Eventually, when the government decided to apply more stringent regulation, Nuclear Fuel Services then opted to abandon the project. 2 radioactive disposal areas at the site are unlined and don't meet standards for even a garbage landfill. This is a very important development. This occurred in 2017. And I've written here, nuclear waste is high risk for New York, but also high risk for the nation. And that's what the General Accounting Office decided in 2017, was that the federal government's environmental liabilities were very high risk for the nation and vulnerable to fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement. And nuclear waste was that major liability that they were talking about as an environmental liability. And they said that DOE's environmental liability, that's the Department of Energy, had been growing over the past 20 years and constitutes the largest share of the federal government's total environmental liability. So in a follow-up report in 2019, GAO found that their environmental liabilities were now 8 times the annual spending on cleanup. In other words, the whole thing had mushroomed out of control. The spending on an annual basis in no way could address all the environmental liabilities that were accumulating. And so that was the status. The latest status was in 2019 that I have here. In November, I'm going to go backwards now again in history. In November 2008, an independent study was released, The Real Costs of Cleaning Up Nuclear Waste at West Valley. This was commissioned with Synapse Energy Economics, an environmental firm. Activist groups in New York obtained funding from Senator Catherine Young and from the New York State Legislature to do this study. The authors included Professor Mike Wilson, PhD of SUNY Fredonia, Marvin Resnikoff, PhD, Radioactive Waste Management Associates, Frank Ackerman, a PhD at Tufts University, and several Synapse professionals. The groups involved included the Coalition on West Valley Nuclear Waste, the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, Citizens Environmental Coalition, and the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice, and that was Lois Gibbs's group. This is the cover of that report that was issued in November 2008. And this is the report findings. Now, I've sort of narrowed them a little bit and picked out the most important ones I wanted to discuss. This is a very lengthy report. There's a lot of information in it. But essentially, alternative 1 was the complete waste excavation. In other words, the radioactive waste would be completely excavated and removed from the West Valley site to a secure site for long-term disposal. No waste at all would remain at West Valley. And you'll see the difference as I go through what is currently at West Valley now. The cost of that was estimated to be $10.6 billion. Alternative 2, which was a DOE alternative, buried waste would remain at West Valley. The cost would only be $2 billion. So of course that was one that Department of Energy favored, but there was no consideration of catastrophic release for radionuclides. and they applied maintenance only for just 200 years. And that 200 was really stretched because toward the end, it was only really watchmen, a couple of watchmen on the site, and that was it. It was a skeleton budget only. The second option there, 2A, alternative 2A, buried waste was maintained for 1,000 years, but it included a lot of erosion controls, and it assumed one catastrophic release into Lake Erie that would require drinking water replacement. So the cost of that was $27.5 billion. So based on those results, most of the public preferred the complete waste excavation and removal in an alternative 1. So that gives you some idea of the cost of what we're talking about here. In addition to that, Synapse estimated the erosion control costs. The total erosion control costs were $332 million. Erosion is an aggressive ongoing process, so it required also replacements for some of the structures that would have to be built, and that would add $7.8 million a year to do the replacements and maintenance. So it would be the $332 million initial plus $7.8 million per year. Now, climate change is going to exacerbate existing erosion with dramatically increased rainfalls over current levels. The U.S. government has estimated that the Northeast is going to experience the most rainfall increase in the nation. Other areas might have lower rainfalls, but that 74% is quite a significant increase. None of the other regions of the country have that predicted. Now, interestingly, shortly after the Synapse report came out, and so this is why I wrote this way, Mother Nature acts to emphasize erosion's significance in the summer of 2009 at West Valley. So what we had was saturating rain for 2 days, followed by more than 5 inches of rain in 1 hour. The damages at West Valley at various locations included the dam and the rain monitoring system, which was destroyed. Most serious was the landslide at the bank of Buttermilk Creek. And that effectively brought the creek 15 feet closer to the state disposal area, which is significant. Several deaths occurred in the region, some from drowning. And the other serious event was that the Gowanda Hospital was severely damaged from flooding and was not rebuilt at all. That hospital had recently built a state-of-the-art emergency facility, and that was completely lost, and the hospital was not replaced. So it was interesting because this followed the Synapse report, and it was emphasizing what they had said about the significance of erosion at West Valley. The bank at Buttermilk Creek, this is a sort of a drawing that was part of this report, and it tried to show what would a stable slope be. And they said that the slope down to Buttermilk Creek would not be stable unless the slope retreats back several hundred feet, essentially halfway to the state disposal area there, which is quite a significant amount of land to have to create this more stable slope. So this describes this a little bit more. The embankment of Buttermilk Creek would not be stable until it retreats back several hundred feet. Landslides need to be stabilized by stopping erosion at the base. Now, this is interesting because there has been no work to reinforce the base of Buttermilk Creek where that previous landslide occurred. Erosion processes would continue to worsen with storms and heavy rainfall. A landslide involving the loss of contents of the state disposal area would include long-lasting radionuclides, including plutonium, a very long-lasting radionuclide. So as of this point, no erosion controls have been planned or implemented right at Buttermilk Creek. This is a picture of sort of a change in the viewpoint of DOE. In 1996, they did an evaluation of the erosion estimates for the South Plateau, which is where the state disposal area and the NRC disposal area are located. This is the abbreviation for the NRC disposal area. And as you can see here, this brown is what they estimated where the erosion would occur at this site. Well, they didn't like that result at all. So in 2005, they did another estimate. And amazingly, the SDA and the NRC disposal area are hardly touched by the erosion. So this still is a point of controversy with the public. We have serious concerns about the Department of Energy's view of how they're handling erosion at this site. It's a serious concern. So now we come to the 2009 draft environmental impact statement. That came out just after the Synapse report. And so, you know, all the public was involved in looking at this very carefully. The draft EIS was produced by both the Department of Energy and the New York State Energy Research and Development Agency. NYSERDA issued its own strong dissenting opinion when this was released, and it focused on major factual matters that had been of concern and prepared by an expert panel that NYSERDA had convened. This particular environmental impact statement was unique among environmental impact statements. An EIS is supposed to establish the knowledge and the factual basis for making final decisions about handling nuclear waste and cleaning up the site. And it would be similar for any other environmental impact statement. You want to establish what the facts are, what we know about it, and that will aid your ability to make decisions about the site. And so it's after you have those facts that you should be choosing your preferred solution. Instead, what this EIS did was to tell us there was inadequate information to make decisions, which DOE proposed to answer in the future. So that's how they proceeded. They said, well, needs more studies. But that's not what an EIS is supposed to do. Now, they proposed to complete 12 studies, and they gave us this list at the time they did the draft EIS and the final EIS. This is what we had, this list of studies. I've put some in red here that are particularly important. And the agencies only completed 2 subject areas, erosion and exhumation. Exhumation would be digging up the waste. And that involved, the exhumation involved a lot because they were looking at both the 2 disposal areas on site as well as the waste tank farm and exhuming that waste. So that was somewhat complex. So significant delays are expected right now. The public unanimously supported a complete cleanup. We did not support the phases. The final EIS came out in 2010, and the Department of Energy opted against the full EIS for all the work and still claimed the need for new studies, and it chose to deal with phase 1 only, including the plans for the studies. So the actual cleanup work for phase one represents just 1% of the buried waste. The completion date for phase one is not known at this point because it's been delayed. Phase two is what the new supplemental EIS will be about, and that's going to deal with 99% of the buried waste that included in the high-level waste tanks. There's four tanks and the two large disposal areas that I mentioned before. We also have a lot of stored waste with no disposition, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that soon. And the new supplemental EIS for the phase two work is expected possibly around 2023. We're not sure at this point. We haven't gotten an update recently on this. So this is a picture that's going to strain your eyes, and I'm sorry about that. My husband actually tried to make the green areas more green so you'd see them. That's why I wanted to show you this picture. This is basically the area of, the property that the state owns is about 2,200 acres, but where most of the facilities are is about 220 acres. And so that's what I show here. And the green areas that are highlighted here, I don't know if you can see them real well, but they're the wetlands on the site. And this is one of the things you really don't want on a site where you're storing radioactive waste. You don't want wetlands and you don't want a lot of waterways. And we have both. We have a lot of waterways. I'll show you some of them. One of them is right here. It goes across the, I'm going to have to go back now, if I can go back. No.
Yep. So Barb, if you navigate to the bottom left of the PowerPoint, there's really tiny arrows, and you should be able to go backwards.
Tiny arrows.
Or if you press escape really quick.
And how do I press escape?
It's the upper left of the keyboard.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. Okay, go back to that picture again. Sorry.
And then you can click again the share for the PowerPoint, which is right next to the plus minus at the bottom. Yeah. Perfect.
Okay. So where was I here? So this Erdman Brook divides the North Plateau from the South Plateau. The North Plateau is where a lot of the processes went on, the main plant process building, the waste tank farm. And the South Plateau is where we have the key disposal areas, the state disposal area, the NRC license disposal area. And then adjacent right to the NRC disposal area is with the storage pad where the high level radioactive waste was vitrified and then stored on this storage pad. So that's where that is. So all of this stuff is in this area. That material, the vitrified waste, could go to somewhere, to a repository permanently, but right now there is no place ready to take it. So it continues to be stored at West Valley. So the other thing that you'll see on the slides is you'll see Franks Creek over here on this part of the slide. You'll see Quarry Creek above. Again, we have a lot of creeks and a lot of wetlands on this site, not desirable for storing any radioactive waste. So here I'm going to talk about the North Plateau cleanup, which is phase one of this work, which came out of the 2010 EIS that was finalized. And again, as I said, the Erdman Brook separates the North and South Plateaus. At the edge of that plateau, there is a construction and demolition debris landfill. That landfill is likely saturated by the strontium plume at this point because that has traveled across the entire plateau. And so it's likely loaded with the strontium 90. There's multiple waste handling buildings on the North Plateau. One building is storing highly radioactive transuranic materials that can only be handled by remote equipment because it's so highly radioactive that people can't handle it. So that was supposed to be disposed elsewhere by 2013, but we currently don't have a place to store it. So it continues to be stored on the North Plateau. We thought it might go to the WIP site, the Waste Isolation Pilot Project in New Mexico. I'll tell you about that place and what happened to that later. The 5 lagoons are on the North Plateau as well. They were used for settling ponds to remove some contaminants just by settling the sludge material, the heavy material out. Also, a strontium 90 permeable treatment wall was built on the North Plateau to remove strontium. It was not part of the phase 1 cleanup. It was built in 2010 and it was supposed to be replaced in 2020, but we have not heard about the plans to actually replace the zeolite in that wall. Once it gets used up, it would need to be replaced. The underground high-level waste tank farm near the main plant process building, the covering is only visible at ground level because all you're seeing is the lids of the tanks because they're all underground. There is a problem because high-level radioactive waste sludge remains, and that's because of the way the tanks were built. They have a real mesh, a complicated mesh at the bottom, and the sludge sort of dried in there and is difficult to get out. So we don't as yet have a plan for how that sludge would be removed. This is the tank farm is one of the phase 2 projects. And then we have the main plant process building. And here's a picture of the main plant process building that it should be demolished in 2022. That would be next year. That's the estimate right now. It's been delayed a lot because of COVID, for one reason, and also because there's one specific area of the building that's got a lot of plutonium, and it's taking a long time to get that plutonium off the walls. So that building is 5 stories tall and is about 350,000 square feet. We're very concerned about it related to the public health. There were 2 very hazardous processes that were undertaken there that contaminated the building. The first was reprocessing to recover plutonium and uranium. And then that plutonium and uranium was supplied to various weapons facilities, other DOE facilities that would use this material for weapons. The second process that was undertaken later on was vitrifying the high-level radioactive waste into a glass-like substance so that it could be stored for a long time. So that was, again, another hazardous process. Now, as part of all this, the planning for the demolition, DOE had promised to evaluate the use of a building enclosure to enclose the building during demolition, and then reneged on that promise. No building enclosure is currently planned, and we're very unhappy about that. DOE also promised NRC and the public that they were preparing a room-by-room inventory of the building. In other words, what radioactivity remained there for each room. We and NRC never received that inventory. In the end, DOE provided only air emissions estimates, which we believe are not adequate. The supplemental EIS for the phase 2 part of the project is delayed. And also a great deal of work is going to be needed on phase 1 has been delayed because of this other work. And it looks like that the phase 1 work won't be finished to maybe 2030 or later. Strontium-90 will continue to leave the site as the permeable treatment wall is only partly effective. DOE has not discussed yet with us when they plan to replace the zeolite. Strontium-90 acts like calcium in the body. It goes to bone, where it may cause bone cancers or also blood-forming cancers because the bone marrow is involved in blood forming. So cancers such as leukemia would be a problem. Now, the DOE says it will only remove the source of the plume, of the strontium plume, which could mean a tiny portion of the original spill, leaving the large plume as is. The original spill occurred near the building, near that large main plant process building, and then it quickly spread on to encompass almost the entire North Plateau. So it is supposed to be demolished in 2022, but that would not include the basement levels, and it's more than one, as well as a lot of piping that's under the basement level. A lot of piping has to be removed. The final thing for the phase 1 will be a big dig. I call it the big dig because it would be a major excavation of the plateau to remove the lagoons, the landfill, the source of the plume, and regrading the property for proper drainage so it doesn't drain toward the waste tanks, which are underground. So here's a picture that we have of the plume as it extended. This is now a 2018 view of the plume on the site. The main plant process building is right here. I don't know if you can see my arrow here. And so it started out fairly small, but over the years, it rapidly expanded across this plateau. And finally, when the DOE put the permeable treatment wall in, this is about where they ended up putting it, almost to the end of the plateau. This one that's labeled sort of WN Swamp is where the property ends for DOE, and it goes downhill from here, so the water would drain down. And this corner here is where the construction and demolition debris landfill is located. And when the permeable treatment wall was put in, this is where it was put. It was filled with the zeolite. And then as this fluid continues to travel across the plateau, it travels through the permeable treatment wall, and the zeolite absorbs the strontium to as much as it can. It's not 100%. So that's, and then you can see these lagoons here that were used to allow some of the discharge water to settle and remove some of the contaminants. Now, phase 2 work will not start until phase 1 is completed. And that phase 2 work is, I've talked about it a little bit before, it's the 2 disposal areas, the NRC one and the state one, the high-level waste tanks. The other issue I added here is the concrete casks that contain the vitrified high-level waste. Under the West Valley Demonstration Project Act, this material should be disposed of elsewhere, but there currently isn't a place for it to go. So that's why I've added it here, because it needs to be properly disposed somewhere. And clearly, the West Valley site is not a good site to have it stay there. So. This is a picture of a trench at the state disposal area. Just shows one of the trenches, and what you'll see here, there's no liner here. Most new modern landfills have liners. This had no liner whatsoever. There's cardboard boxes here, cardboard containers. So there's no way you could consider that this waste is contained in any way. There are fissures and cracks in the soil. There's been a lot of water flowing at the site. So contaminants are moving with the radionuclides that were stored on the site. So we're getting toward the end here now. There have been ongoing DoE management problems, both at West Valley as well as across the nation. At WIP, which is the Waste Isolation Pilot Project in New Mexico, the use of organic kitty litter caused an explosion and the release of plutonium, impacting workers at the site. Only a national repository, this was the only national repository in the nation at the time, and it was closed for several years. All shipments were halted. And a long queue is now vying for the use of this disposal facility. So it is highly unlikely that West Valley would be able to get into that queue and use this site. And there's a fight going on as to whether the WIP will be expanded. That's I believe DOE's intent is to expand this site to a larger area. At Hanford in Washington State, there were 2 plutonium air releases during a building demolition that occurred, 2 of them, before an expert panel was finally called in to review what was going on. So this is just to highlight some problems that are occurring around the country. I'm not trying to list them all, just a few for you. In the South and West, wildfires have burned in areas that are contaminated with radioactivity. Now, wildfires are another problem associated with climate change, and we're seeing them in the South and the West. And when an area is burned, that radioactivity is dispersed to the air. So this is a serious concern as well, although wildfires are not as likely where we are, given the fact that we anticipate much increased rainfall in our area. But I want to mention that about the wildfires because that's a serious issue for a number of sites around the country. So potential climate change impacts at West Valley. The region has numerous hills and steep valleys. The water continues to carve into the landscape. Severe rainfalls will increase erosion impacts. And West Valley is not prepared for any of this. Severe storms also and wind impacts could affect the site. For example, we could lose the covers, or they could be just peeled back over the disposal areas, and it would allow more water in to flow through the waste and off site. We have limited erosion controls to date, and they will not be able to handle a heavy rainfall. So a new supplementary environmental impact statement should be fully evaluating the impacts of climate change and include protective measures to control erosion and landsliding. The climate interaction with radioactive waste poses public health impacts. So the oversight of West Valley management, we're going to end on this one here. DOE Central Management Office identified problematic work performance at West Valley. These problems were noted in the official report of the DOE Inspector General in April 2017. The DOE Inspector General found that after approving a $333 million contract for Phase 1 work at West Valley, the contractor identified major work that was not included in the scope of work. Again, this was the contractor who identified the work that was not included. Specifically, the major task of moving 222 containers of high-dose transuranic waste that must be handled remotely and moved out of the main plant prior to demolishing the building. So I want to go over this in a little bit of detail. This is not a small item on your list when you write up a list of work to be done. And say you have work at your house and you want to hire a contractor. This was not a small item to eliminate. And the reason is that those 222 containers were the high-level radioactive waste that had to be handled remotely with remote equipment. Each of these stainless steel containers had to be placed in a huge cement cask. 5 of the stainless steel containers would go into the cement cask. And because this thing was so heavy, they had to even reinforce the floor of the main plant to be able to move this. And then once they're all in this heavy concrete cask, they had to be carried individually. That individual single concrete cask had to be maneuvered down to the South Plateau and placed on the concrete pad. So this took several months of work. This was not quick. Some of it was done in 1 year, but then because it got to be winter, it had to be carried over to the next year. And it resulted in $196 million addition to the contract, and it also required a 3-year extension to the contract. So this was a very serious issues. And I'm highlighting it for you so that you understand that a lot has gone on at West Valley that has not gone well. We continue to be watchdogs for this process. And we continue to have difficulties trying to get better performance. And that's it. So I'm anxious to hear your questions, and hopefully we can answer them between Dee and I. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Barbara. We did have a couple of questions while you were presenting, and I don't know if it's possible. Before the questions, the light in front of you is whiting out your face a little bit. I don't know if it's possible to adjust that a little bit.
Yeah, I was trying to do that, but it seems like in order to have the light on in this room, I had to do that. I don't know if I can turn a different light. You want me to try
That's
to turn a different light?
No,
Okay.
that's okay. So we're getting some questions in the chat, and the ones that were messaged while you were presenting, and they said that you may have answered them, but in one of the presentations you said that information from the EIS was missing. They said they weren't able to have a really thorough EIS. It was different than previous EISs or typical EISs because there was information or data that was missing. What information was missing, and has that been resolved to where it can be collected right now?
Well, one of the key things that I identified that was a problem is that DOE said this EIS is different because we need to do more studies. Well, they were supposed to do the studies as part of that work and then present the facts and make a decision. And they were saying they used the EIS as a way to say we need to do more studies. That's really not a proper EIS. And hopefully the next EIS that we get will be better than that. So, and basically they took the years between 2010 and 2020 to do all those studies. So while we have those studies, the DOE has not reached a conclusion. And I hope I'm explaining that better now.
Great, yeah. And then just, this was more of a brief comment you had made. Did you say that the North Plateau is likely very radioactive, as in it's not really known whether or not it's radioactive right now?
Well, the North Plateau has a number, I mean, it has the one problem of the the strontium plume, but it also has these buildings that are storing a lot of high-level waste. One set of it was supposed to be moved to another location in 2013, but DOE never managed the transfer. And we have more waste there now, from cleaning out the main plant of all of its waste. So there is still a lot of waste stored on the North Plateau.
Great, thank you.
And Diane can add things too if she wants to some of the questions.
Yeah, and I saw Ray had typed something in the chat about the peak dose of either 300,000 mREM per year or less than 25 mREM per year, depending on which DOE NYSERDA document you look at.
What was that, a question?
Nope, I think that was just a comment related to the question as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of difficulty with DOE documents and not being accurate and trying to get what the true situation is.
Great. And just one question from earlier until I get to the ones that were just asked. Does West?
Can I just say what Ray's comment was, that the peak dose was either 300,000 millirems, which is a calculation of dose, 300,000 millirems per year in one study, and then in another study, it's less than 25 millirems per year. So it depends which DOE NYSERDA study you or document you look at on the amount of dose from the site.
Uh-huh.
So it's a big range.
Yeah, which means they're not being very precise.
Great. And then this question was, does the West Valley Nuclear Waste Site publicly report their information? I think this was, you had mentioned something about something should have happened in 2010 or in 2000. But you're not really sure whether or not that happened. Whose responsibility is to share whether or not changes have been made?
Well, I'm not sure what particularly that is being referred to, but we've had a problem with communication with DOE for some time. It has gotten worse lately. And what can we say about this? Dee, do you have a ready response on this?
Could you say the question again? I couldn't find it on the chat. Sorry.
It was just privately chatted. Does West Valley Nuclear Waste Site
have annual reporting or regular reporting?
Publicly report their information, because I think Barbara had referenced that a change was supposed to be made. I think this was in a previous slide. A change was supposed to be made, and it's not sure whether or not that actually had happened.
Well, to answer the first part, and I'm Diane DeRigo with Nuclear Information Resource Service, part of the West Valley Action Network. There's an annual report that's put out by the Department of Energy called the ASER, Annual Site Environmental Report. It comes out every September for the year before. And NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research Development Authority, they also do an annual report. So the reports that are done, they're not telling, when they report on releases from the site, you don't find out about it until a year later. And that's why I don't know if that was what Barb was talking about, but we've been calling for off-site monitoring during the demolition of the building so that we can have real-time monitoring and reporting, publicly reported to the public as it happens, so that we can know what's being released or what's being detected being released. And that is what we're pushing for. It's not what we have.
Right.
And then there was a question, is there a national strategy or even study at DOE or Congress about the management and, quote, institutional control of nuclear waste sites because of climate change?
I would
Not that I
say,
know of.
yeah, yeah. I think we're in a very difficult situation right now. Clearly, the General Accounting Office has identified a significant problem. And I think we need to really push the envelope here because it really is out of control. There are a lot of sites that have major issues. And it's really costing an obscene amount of money because they're making incredibly serious mistakes. And what we have to worry about is really the mistakes affecting the public health in the future. Because these radionuclides, some of them last for thousands of years. And so will be affecting future generations if people are exposed to drinking water or through material just leaving the site. That's what we have to worry about. So we want this done right. We want it cleaned up and secured so that more people can't be exposed to this material.
And we want an enclosure over the demolition while it's being,
Right.
while the building's being taken down, so that any radioactivity that's still there doesn't spread across, either locally right on the nearby farmland or further up to Buffalo or downstream to the Seneca Nation, or it can get around. I mean, the Chernobyl radioactivity, it went around, it was detectable around the globe multiple times. So the amount of radioactivity that gets out, even if it's a small amount of plutonium, it's essentially basically permanent because it lasts so long. So we really need to prevent it from getting out at any level.
Great. There's a comment and a question. So one of the comments was, it seems like without a proper EIS, it seems irresponsible to continue and move forward with any actions on the site. So that was more just a comment. And then a question from someone, what are some of the public health consequences? I know one of the previous presenters had touched on these, but if you could allude to either Barbara or Diane, if you could allude to what are specifically some of the public health consequences that could come as a result of this exposure.
Well, the one that's most often cited is cancer. The one that's not mentioned very often, but is certainly a problem, is birth defects. So cancer and birth defects, but there are other things, because some of these things also affect some of the body systems, like your immune systems. So there'd be other, weakening of your immune system would make you vulnerable to other things, other infections and things like that. So it's a broad range of effects that might.
And they're seeing more that it could affect heart health, that could cause ischemic heart disease, exposure to radioactivity.
Yeah, and particularly in Chernobyl, a lot of children were severely affected with heart disease.
And the other thing is that it doesn't have to be a big explosion like Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island releases or Fukushima. If we're having routine releases and exposures to low dose radiation, that's in some cases more harmful than one big hit. And if it's being released in our water supply and into our air and our environment, then we could be exposed over and over again.
Thank you. There was another question. Have various levels of politicians, for example, local, state, federal, been approached, and what have been their responses?
Well, at the last environmental impact statement, we had pretty much across the board, counties, towns, cities, state legislators and federal legislators from Western New York calling on the DOE and NYSERDA to do a full cleanup of that site. And rather than make the decision to do a full cleanup of the site, as Barb described, the decision was made to do a phase decision, and they do phase one, the things that Department of Energy and New York NYSERDA agreed on for 10 years. And now, as that 10 years is over, they're going to enter into phase two, and they're going to decide what the final outcome is. So we've had agreement by our agencies, by our elected officials. But what we need now is to renew those demands and to get the new governor, the legislature, and the legislative committees with jurisdiction to demand that the New York State agencies, the Health Department, the Environment Department, and NYSERDA, that they assert all authority to watchdog what's going on and to push for the most stringent cleanup possible.
Right. We really need New York State to play a more active role, because really the federal government is not doing the job in this area. And they tend to keep feeding the weapons complex the money. Part of DOE is weapons, and they get far more money than the cleanup side of DOE.
So on the officials, what people need to do, I would ask that we remind our elected officials now that we're going to have another supplemental environmental impact statement coming up next year, and we're going to need to renew our demands for the full cleanup. And especially now during the demolition, or the beginning of the demolition, we need state officials to use whatever power they can to get that thing covered so it's not demolished and releasing radioactivity that we don't even know about around the countryside into the water. And then also that the state could be doing monitoring, or getting the Department of Energy to do monitoring and reporting that regularly, off-site monitoring.
Related to that question, and then there's a couple other separate questions. Are there any particular committees within the legislature that could champion these asks that you're talking about?
In both the House and the Assembly and the Senate, it would be the Energy Committee, the Environment Committee, and possibly the Economic Development Committees.
Great. Someone had asked, is there a health database of people that have already been affected by this? So any of the health implications by West Valley or other nuclear waste sites?
Well, Barb, you would know more about what kind of health records are kept, but there's not.
I do know that they had a workers group because, of their exposures that was identified, and the agency works, that's with NIOSH, I believe.
Well, there's not been a health study of the people around West Valley. There was a feasibility study done to do a feasibility study, and a health study was not done. There are studies that have been done around other nuclear sites where they compare the birth health, birth weight before and after the reactors start operating, which appear to indicate increases in low birth weight babies. But we don't have any before and after at West Valley, and it's complicated because we've had big exposures, big releases from the 60s to the 70s, and then we had a lull when everything stopped and the site was being maintained. And now during the demolition and during the solidification, there was higher amount of radioactivity that could be getting out. And so now we could be during the demolition having higher exposures, but there's not been comparisons in relation to what activities are going on.
Great, thank you. I think those were a lot of the questions that we had in the chat. If others have questions, feel free to type them in the chat. There were a couple comments that I just wanted to voice over, just because I know not everyone reads the chat. They might be watching the recording. So New York State EQR has only required consideration of climate change impacts in recent years. Some folks have asked for this change when it became clear climate change was having a significant impact on the Earth's ecosystem. So this gets to one of the questions that was asked earlier about whether climate change has been seriously considered when doing any of these analyses.
I feel that DOE was in a prime position to do it. And unfortunately, they didn't. They originally were a co-lead with EPA on climate change before Trump came in. So they had a very significant role in evaluating climate change impacts. But pertaining to West Valley, they did not take it this seriously. And it's been very disappointing. In fact, they allowed some folks who were working on a project for West Valley recently to say that, just sort of place the argument about what's coming next is not going to be glaciation. So they spent time looking at whether we would have glaciers forming, and they didn't evaluate the real thing that we have, which is global warming. And they never really did that at all. So that was kind of a waste of time, because we know we're not going into a glaciation period anytime soon.
And some of our groups of the West Valley Action Network routinely attend and participate in meetings at the site. And we have repeatedly for years called for climate change to be calculated as part of the analysis. And it is not been included. And it's so obvious, especially with the 2009 Buttermilk Creek moving 15 to 20 feet closer to the site. And it's only about a quarter of a mile away to begin with. How many of those big storms before it hits the waste and the waste is released? So climate change is a big deal, and it has not been adequately considered.
Great, thank you. We don't have any new questions, but we do have a couple new folks who had joined us today. So I know it has been shared with some other folks about what are some of the next steps. I know, Diane, you had mentioned approaching some specific elected officials, but what other things is the network hoping for? Are some next steps that people can take moving forward?
Barb, do you want to go, or do you want me to?
I'm trying to think other than what you already said. I mean, obviously we're going to be pursuing all of this, but
why don't I take it and then you can
go ahead.
So really what's going on at the site right now is there's a physical cleanup going on, which is a really good thing, that cleanup is being done, that the waste is being dealt with. However, this is just one step in the cleanup process. Removing the big reprocessing building that has been there since the 60s. It's so contaminated. There's been really great effort cleaning it out. But right now, we really need our elected officials, our local elected people, to get the state officials, to get the federal officials, to get the Department of Energy to put an enclosure over it. It's been done over many sites, Superfund sites. There was a smaller reprocessing building in Niskayuna, New York, that was enclosed during its decommissioning. There was an enclosure over other Department of Energy buildings when they were demolished. It's a physical possibility, and it would protect us. So we need our governor and our elected officials to do whatever it takes to make that happen. We haven't been able to convince the Department of Energy over years of asking and asking. Now it's really going to become a political decision. They're not going to do it unless they're forced to do it. And we don't want them to stop the cleanup. We want them to do it in a way that doesn't spread the stuff. It's invisible. You can't see, smell, or taste it. So we need special detection equipment that reports to us in the direction of the winds, so we know what's being released, if anything. So right now, the big pushes that we're asking for with regard to the physical cleanup, and that's immediate, it could start in December, January, February, is enclosure, monitoring offsite with real-time reporting. And then for the longer haul, We want an electronic library. We want all of the materials, the reports that are compiled and being used to make decisions at West Valley to be made public and accessible in a searchable database, so that it'll be left for us for the decision making, but then also for future generations, because this stuff is not going away quick. So that's the immediate asks. And then with regard to the final decision making, we've got a supplemental environmental impact statement coming down the pike. We're waiting to find out what the full scope is going to be. And we need to get a lot of comments. We need to pack the hearings. We need to educate ourselves on what it says and make our demands through that supplemental environmental impact process. And that'll be later in 2022.
Right.
Thank you.
So call your assembly members, call your senators and your town officials, and maybe we should start the resolutions for the full cleanup and for monitoring.
Great. Well, I think those were all the questions that we had for this evening. I do want to encourage folks. I know our West Valley Action Network, different organizations are really responsive to any questions that you all might have. If you do or are able to contact your elected officials, they would love to know. They would love to hear about your experiences. So we really encourage you to reach back out. I'll be sending around an email, like I had mentioned, with this recording and links to previous recordings, as well as the material, the information in the chat. But if you do have any additional questions that you may not have been able to ask tonight, please reach out to myself and I can forward them to any of the folks in the network, and we'll put their email information in the chat and in the follow-up email. So thanks, everybody. Have a great evening.
Thank you all.
Yeah, and thanks to PPG Buffalo for sponsoring this.
For sponsoring it, yes. And thanks for all your help with the technical issues.
Of course.